waiting for this economic recession. And, in the United States, it continues to be robust on the economic side. And in Canada, I'd actually argue that we've already seen, or we're in the middle of a bit of a recession already. We're seeing the pain felt in real time. So I think the reality is that economy is going to have some impact of the higher interest rate.
Every day, life appears to be going on much as it always has in the Great White North. People hurry to work, run errands, and go about their daily lives with a sense of normalcy and routine. But beneath this veneer of ordinary life, a growing sense of unease and uncertainty is bubbling up as more and more Canadians come to realize that something is deeply amiss with the country's economic fortunes. This sense of disquiet is not the result of some sudden shock or catastrophic event, but rather the cumulative effect of a slow and steady erosion of living standards and economic prospects that has been unfolding for years. For the average Canadian, these abstract economic indicators bear little resemblance to the lived reality of their day-to-day struggles. According to Statistics Canada, the country's population grew more in the third quarter of 2023 than at any time since 1957. And even more telling, just the growth for the first 9 months of 2023 was more than any full year since Confederation. This combination of a slowly growing national economy and surging population has meant that per-person GDP has dwindled from $60,178 in the second quarter of 2022, when it peaked post-COVID, to $58,111 in the fourth quarter of 2023, symbolizing a decline of $2,066, all figures inflation adjusted, or 3.4%. On the 1st of May 2020, the C.D. Howe Institute's Business Cycle Council announced that Canada entered a recession in the first quarter of 2020. The recession's trough occurred in April of that year, but as of May 2020, the Canadian economy began recovering. In 2023, the real gross domestic product, or GDP, declined 0.3% in the third quarter, following a 0.3% increase in the second quarter. The decrease in international exports and slower inventory accumulation were partially offset by government spending and housing investment increases. Unlike traditional recessions that affect the economy as a whole, per capita recessions strike at the very core of individual prosperity, revealing a troubling trend of declining standards of living. In recent years, Canada has found itself grappling with the ominous specter of per capita recession, raising alarms about its citizens' well-being and the economy's overall state. In this video, we will delve into the nuances of Canada's per capita recession, exploring its causes, consequences, dynamics, and potential effect on Canadians as they navigate these turbulent economic waters. More and more Canadians are worried the economy will soon slip into recession. Some economists have already sounded the alarm. Our current analysis indicates the Canadian economy will experience a marked slowdown this year but avoid a recession. Yes, there's a difference between a slowdown and a recession. So what does recession actually mean? Recessions are a normal and expected part of the business cycle. In its simplest and most widespread definition, a recession is characterized by 2 consecutive quarters of falling real GDP. However, the culprit behind this disconnect in Canadian society is a phenomenon known as a per capita recession, a state of economic malaise in which the overall size of the economy may be growing, but the average person's share of that growth is actually shrinking. It's a situation in which the gains of economic expansion are being increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the vast majority of Canadians are left to contend with stagnating wages, rising costs of living, and a sense of being left behind. To understand the concept of a per capita recession, it is essential to first distinguish it from the more commonly understood notion of a recession as a measure of GDP. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. It is the most widely used measure of economic growth and is often used as a barometer of a nation's overall economic health. However, GDP is an aggregate measure that tells us little about how the fruits of economic growth are being distributed among the population. It is entirely possible for a country's GDP to be growing while the average person's standard of living is actually declining. This is precisely what happens in a per capita recession. The economy as a whole may be expanding, but the average person's slice of the pie is getting smaller. To illustrate this concept, consider the following example. Imagine a country with a population of 100 people and a GDP of $1 million. If that GDP were to grow by 10% to $1.1 million, but the population population also grew by 10% to 110 people, then the per capita GDP, the amount of economic output per person, would remain unchanged. In other words, despite the overall economic growth, the average person's standard of living would not have improved. Now consider a more extreme scenario. Suppose the same country's GDP grew by 20% to $1.2 million, but its population grew by 30% to 130 people. In this case, the per capita GDP would actually plunge from $10,000 per person to just over $9,200 per person. This is the essence of a per capita recession, a situation in which the economy is growing but not fast enough to keep pace with population growth, resulting in a decline in the average person's standard of living. Economic growth does not necessarily equate to financial prosperity. While aggregate GDP is one thing, the standard of living is another. When Canada's economic performance is adjusted for the rising population count, it reveals a picture that leaves much to be desired. The country's lagging standing in per capita GDP is not new, but has worsened since the pandemic. Canada's real GDP per capita has been deteriorating for many years. At the start of the 1980s, Canada enjoyed an edge against the average of advanced economies of almost $4,000, while keeping relatively level with U.S. estimates. By 2000, this advantage had all but evaporated, and U.S. per capita GDP had pulled ahead of Canada's to the tune of over $8,000. Still, since the 2014-15 oil shock, Canada's performance has gone from bad to worse. Canadian real GDP per capita has grown at a meager rate of only positive 0.4% annually, paling in comparison to the advanced economy average of positive 1.4%. In Canada, the signs of a per capita recession have been mounting for years. According to data from Statistics Canada, real GDP per capita, that is GDP adjusted for inflation and population growth, has been essentially flat since the early 2000s. In 2024, real GDP per capita has remained stagnant at 1.9%. This is a far cry from the robust growth rates of the 1950s and 1960s, when real GDP per capita grew by more than 2% per year. But the headline numbers only tell part of the story. When we dig deeper into the data, we find that the gains of even this meager growth have been far from evenly distributed. According to a report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the wealthiest 1% of Canadians captured almost a third of all income growth between 1982 and 2015, while the bottom 50% of the population saw their share of income actually decline over the same period. Meanwhile, the cost of living has continued to climb, with housing, healthcare, and education costs rising far faster than wages. As a result, many Canadians are finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet, even as they work longer hours and take on more debt to keep up. The human toll of this economic stagnation is impossible to ignore. In March 2023, there were almost 2 million visits to food banks across Canada, representing a 32% increase compared to March of 2022 and a 78.5% increase compared to March of 2019, which is the highest year-over-year increase in usage ever reported. Homelessness and housing insecurity have also become increasingly prevalent, with more than 235,000 Canadians experiencing homelessness in a given year, a figure that has risen by 70% since 2005. Perhaps most alarmingly, the economic strains of the per capita recession are taking a severe toll on the mental health of Canadians. According to a recent survey by the Canadian Mental Health Association, nearly half of Canadians, or 37%, reported that their mental health has deteriorated since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, with concerns about financial stability and job security ranking among the top stressors. But while the pandemic has certainly exacerbated these economic challenges, it is crucial to recognize that the roots of Canada's per capita recession go much deeper. For decades, successive governments have pursued policies that have prioritized the interests of big business and the wealthy over the needs of ordinary Canadians. From tax cuts for corporations and the rich to the erosion of social programs and labor protections, these policies have contributed to a massive upward redistribution of wealth and power that has left the average Canadian behind. One particular egregious example of this trend is the explosion of corporate profits in recent years, even as wages have stagnated and poverty has deepened. According to a report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canada's largest corporations' average pre-tax profit margin reached a record high of 19.6% in mid-2022, even as millions of Canadians struggle to make ends meet amid a global pandemic. Meanwhile, the effective tax rate paid by these same corporations has steadily declined for decades, from over 50% in the 1960s to just over 25.43% as of 2022. The state of affairs is not only deeply unfair, but also economically unsustainable. As more and more Canadians are pushed to the brink of financial ruin, the very foundations of the initial consumer-driven economy are being eroded. When people are struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads, they have little disposable income left over to spend on the goods and services that drive economic growth. Over time, this can lead to a vicious cycle of declining demand, rising unemployment, and further economic stagnation. At first glance, it may be easy to point the finger at rapid population growth as the solo driver of poor per capita GDP, given that it has inflated the denominator of the calculation. However, this is an oversimplification that masks the true story. Although it is a recent development, Canadian headcount is growing at a historically high 3% yearly. In fact, the average population growth rate since 2020, 1.2%, has only marginally exceeded the pre-2000 level. Real GDP growth, on the other hand, has been declining since the 1980s. This implies that the real culprit is insufficient growth in the numerator, or real GDP. In other words, Canada was able to sustain higher GDP growth rates in prior decades at population growth levels similar to today. At the core of the issue is a sagging productivity slowing that has been plaguing the Canadian economy for many years, despite the well-intentioned moves of this country's policymakers to try and address it. When measured on a real GDP per hour worked basis, Canadian labor productivity has been trailing behind its peers, notably the US. Even in the face of productivity woes, Canada has been able to sustain a higher output level in recent years through both an unsustainable pace of job creation and total hours worked. Despite mounting evidence of the toll that the per capita recession is taking on ordinary Canadians, there's been little urgency or political will to address the root causes of this crisis. Instead, we've seen a continuation of the same tired policies that have led us to this point: tax cuts for the wealthy, austerity for the rest, and blind faith in the ability of the markets to solve all our problems. This decline in Canadian living standards is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. According to the OECD's 2021 report, Canada is expected to record the lowest growth rates in per-person GDP up to 2060 of any industrialized country, which would mean countries such as New Zealand, Italy, Korea, Turkey, and Estonia would all leapfrog Canada with higher living standards. Unfortunately for Canadians, little turnaround in Canadian living standards appears to be on the horizon. Real GDP per capita has already contracted over the last 3 quarters, and our most recent forecast points to persistent contractions until the end of 2024. Given the nation's enormous economic potential and opportunities, this should be unacceptable to all Canadians, regardless of political or ideological leanings. Given the nation's enormous economic potential and opportunities, this should be unacceptable to all Canadians, regardless of political or ideological leanings. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.